Hi everyone, in this video we will be discussing the West. We are going to be analyzing Indian policies, the cattle industry boom, and the causes and effects of Western expansion, and we will evaluate the American Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. When we are finished, you will share with your partner 3 causes and 3 effects of westward expansion. The first thing I want you to do is to get your maps and color in and label the different regions of the United States. This will help you get a good picture of the regions of the United States that I am speaking about throughout the lecture when I refer to things like the West or the Midwest. Okay, so let's talk about the frontier. The frontier is what we refer to as the line that separated the settled areas in the east from the unsettled wilderness in the west. And the reason why unsettled is in quotation marks is that because it wasn't completely unsettled, there were people living there. It was the Native Americans who possessed that land, and they were going to be pitted against the settlers who are encroaching on their territory and forcing them out. So what was it that attracted people to the West in the first place? Well, it started with the California Gold Rush in 1848, which attracted more than 300,000 people from the United States and abroad who hoped to strike it rich by finding gold. The rush in California died out, and then we pick up another rush of gold in 1896 in the Klondike River area in the Yukon Territory of Alaska. Somebody found the gold nugget, and so this led to over 100,000 people heading over to Alaska, but of that 100,000, only about 30,000 made it all the way up to the region because of the weather. But a lot of them turned back or settled in other places along the way. There were other discoveries of minerals. Things like gold and silver were found in Alaska, in the Rocky Mountains, and in the Black Hills of North Dakota. And wherever this resource was found, thousands of people moved there, and these mining towns just sprung up overnight. And it seems that just as quickly as they sprung up, a lot of them were abandoned when the resources would dry up. And that's where we get a lot of ghost towns in these regions as well. So, as you can imagine, there was conflict that erupted between the Native Americans and the Americans as they started moving into the West. Tensions increased because Union troops had been stationed in forts along the frontier after the Civil War to ensure that Americans were safe west of the frontier line. But when people started to move into the Black Hills of Dakota in search of gold, the Sioux were up in arms about this because they were asked to move from their sacred grounds. And so it often resulted in violent confrontations between the natives and the new settlers. At the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse of the Sioux were able to defeat General George Custer, and they killed 264 American soldiers in this skirmish. Eventually, Crazy Horse was captured and killed by the American army, and most of the Sioux were then forced to move on to these reservations. In 1890, U.S. soldiers slaughtered over 300 unarmed Sioux men, women, and children with machine guns at the Wounded Knee Massacre. So this is not one of the high points of American Indian relationships, and it's one of these infamous conflicts between the Native American tribes and the U.S. military. So the railroad had an impact on the West as well, because the Transcontinental Railroad, which was completed in 1869, reduced the journey from the east to the west from 6 months to just about 10 days. And this is going to enable the settlement of the West because people can not only move to the West faster, but now you can also ship crops from these new areas to the eastern market, so people can actually make a living by living in the West. The impact the railroads have on Native Americans, of course, is negative. The tracks often ran through the Native American territory, and there were sharpshooters who came by train to kill buffalo in the Great Plains. The buffalo fur was highly coveted during this time period, and so they came and slaughtered a lot of the buffalo living in the Great Plains, which affected the Plains Indians because they relied on the buffalo for their subsistence. here's a pile that you can see of all the hide of buffalo that they killed. I mean, they would kill hundreds of buffalo at a time. And this here is a pile of skulls from the sharpshooters who killed buffalo in the plains. And so you can imagine that killing so many of these buffalo would limit the amount of food that Native Americans had to rely on. Here's a journal entry for this lecture. I want you to read this excerpt from the Texas legislature, who was considering a bill to protect the buffalo from sharpshooters. And General Philip Sheridan spoke out against the bill. So I want you to read it and then contemplate how Sheridan felt about the slaughter of buffalo on the Great Plains, and tell me what effect you think it had. He was predicting if the slaughter continued. All right, so land was greatly available in the West because it was quote-unquote unsettled. The Homestead Act was passed in 1862, which was signed by President Lincoln, and basically it stated that any citizen would be given 160 acres of government land that they could live on, and if they made improvements on the land and lived on it for at least 5 years, they grew crops on it and maintained it, then after 5 years they would own the property. And so this attracted a lot of Americans and a lot of European immigrants to the area because there was cheap land available for them. Here's an excerpt from the Homestead Act that I want you to analyze, and then I want you to list the requirements that a settler had to meet in order to settle on federal land. Okay, so another industry that grew during the Gilded Age, thanks to westward expansion, was the cattle industry. So longhorn cattle roamed the Great Plains in Texas, and Texans began to wrangle the cattle and drive them north to the railroads in Kansas, and from there the railroads would ship them to the slaughterhouses in Chicago, so that meat would be sent to markets in the east. So this resulted in what we called cattle drives, which took about 3 months for the Texans to gather the cattle and drive them up to Kansas to the railroads, and they would cross through Indian territory, and along the way they would graze on the grasses of the open range because there were no fenced lands during this time. And this is where we get the cowboy. So the Texans learned to ride, rope, and brand from Mexican vaqueros, and then they would take over these herds of cattle and drive them up to Kansas. And this became a romanticized symbol of American individualism, and we also see the growth of Western music, which celebrates the cowboy life. However, most of the cowboys were very lonely and isolated from the rest of society, and unknown to most people, 1 in 5 of these cowboys were actually African American. Here's a group of African American cowboys from the Gilded Age. The cattle industry did begin to decline because of overgrazing. Overgrazing destroyed a lot of the grass in the plains, so there was not any food for the cattle to eat along the way. You also saw that sheep herders and farmers fenced the land with barbed wire, so the cattle could not roam freely anymore, and there was a lot of extreme weather that killed millions of cattle. So instead of having these cattle herded and shipped to Kansas, instead we see ranchers settle down and breed cattle for the same purposes. So the part of the subsistence of the Great Plains was the availability of land for farming. The Homestead Act and the railroads enabled farmers to move west. About half of them were actually European immigrants, and the other half were the children of farmers from the East and the Midwest who moved because of the availability of land. Initially, though, it was difficult to settle in these new lands because of the hostility that they faced from Indians and also from cattlemen. Cattlemen used to form associations, and they hired men to attack the homesteaders because they didn't like that this land was now private and their cattle couldn't roam freely in the area. However, the army, the barbed wire, and a large number of farmers helped to overcome these threats that farmers faced. There were also natural obstacles in their ways. For example, railroad advertisements used to promote these well-watered, wooded lands that were very fertile, but when farmers arrived, they found that there was very little rainfall, there were few trees, the soil was tough, and there were extreme temperatures, very, very hot summers and really, really cold winters. There was plagues of grasshoppers that would destroy their crops, and also the personal isolation because these rural areas kept them away from interacting with other people. And a lot of them starved, or they just returned east because it was so difficult. Those who remained, however, had to endure hours of heavy work and long cold winters if they wanted to survive. However, through technological ingenuity, they were able to survive. They built sod houses because there were no trees to build log cabins. So they would get clumps of grass and soil and make their houses out of that. They also used barbed wire to keep animals off of their farms and their crops from being eaten. They used steel plows because they were able to turn the soil that was so hard, and they had drilling equipment that was used to dig deep water wells and windmills because they didn't have access to water nearby. Harvesters and threshers were also machines that were used to reduce the amount of work that workers had to physically do on farms. And Native Americans lost control of the West as a result of this. They were forcefully removed from their lands, and a flood of settlers, because of the Homestead Act and the railroads, really pretty much pushed them off their territory. They were defeated by the government in the Indian Wars, and their natural environment was destroyed by the newcomers. The reservation life was very tough for Native Americans. Lands were usually smaller than their original land, and they usually got the most undesirable, unfertile land. The federal government promised to give them food, blankets, and seeds, but they seldom followed through. And the Dawes Act of 1887 was what forced the Americanization of Native Americans. Through the Dawes Act, the U.S. government abolished all the tribes and sold their tribal lands, and instead they granted private land to each family and forced them to farm, which was very difficult for them to do because the Native Americans were culturally hunters. They did not know how to farm, and they promised citizenship and the right to vote to those who complied. The Dawes Act threatened Native American culture because, like I mentioned, they were hunters, not farmers, and so it was difficult for them to settle down in one area. And also, they were given infertile land and no equipment or instruction on how to farm, so they were pretty much set up for failure. People on reservations often suffered from malnutrition, poverty, and health issues, and the government offered them no help. The American Citizenship Act was passed in 1924 to replace the Dawes Act, and this piece of legislation granted immediate citizenship to all Native Americans that were born in the United States. This was a huge step towards giving civil rights to Native Americans, especially because, unlike the Dawes Act, Native Americans didn't have to give up their tribal lands or their customs in order to become American citizens. Alright, and that brings us to the end of the lecture. So if you guys have any questions, bring them to class. And like always, thank you for watching.